First things first, can you get out some lined paper and a pen? And we're going to just take... We're going to take some notes on some key contexts that apply to the chapter the last night, okay? So the first thing I wanted to go back over is the social hierarchy in Victorian times. So we know that it was very regimented. You had the lower class and the upper class, and the upper class people were perceived as superior, not just because of their wealth, but because they were just seen as better people intrinsically by virtue of being higher up on the social ladder. So that's something to bear in mind when we look at the interactions between the upper class characters such as Utterson and the lower class characters, servants such as Poole. Another thing that I want you to be remembering as we read through is conventions of Gothic literature, which we've spoken about quite a lot, and how they're often replicated by Stevenson. And the good thing about talking about Gothic conventions is that not only will you get credited for AO3, context, understanding the genre within which he's writing, you will also get credited for AO2 because you're talking about his methods. A lot of extracts do also evidence conventions of the Gothic genre, so so long as it's relevant to the question, it's definitely a nice thing to comment on. Conventions of the Gothic genre being extremes of emotion, characters who are experiencing heightened emotion, be that fear, be that sadness, a pathetic fallacy, most often fog to create this air of mystery and the unknown, and uncertainty. It's also a Gothic convention to bring in the supernatural, but in a more subtle way, so more subtle incorporation of supernatural elements where you're not quite sure, is this real, is this not? It's that kind of questioning that's very conventional of the Gothic. So not only does the novella reflect on developments that were happening in science, so the development of psychology, pharmacology, pseudosciences like graphology, physiognomy we've spoken about. It also, I think, in many ways can be seen to reflect on developments that were happening in philosophy. So philosophy is how we make sense of the world around us. Philosophy is the study of what is real, what is true about human experience. And what you had during the 19th century was a growing number of philosophies that were challenging the nature of reality, basically. So there's one kind of way of looking at reality, which is from a very objective standpoint. So you can kind of adopt an objectivist view of things. If you were to believe that reality is something that's objective, basically what that means is you think there's one reality, we all live in this reality, and it's based on facts and laws and truths that are correct always and everywhere. There's nothing about this reality that can't be understood via logic or reason. Everything within this reality has a rational explanation for it. So reality is fixed, it's concrete, and we just live in it. That's one way of looking at reality. So if we think back to the character of Lanyon, for Lanyon, he didn't like Jekyll's experiments. He thought it was balderdash because they seemed to somehow defy logic and reason, whatever it was Jekyll was getting up to. So Lanyon, as a character, had a very objectivist way of seeing reality. On the other hand, the philosophies were emerging that took more of a subjectivist approach. So subjectivism, within that way of viewing the world, that type of philosophy, the only thing that's real are our thoughts and our feelings, and reality is not fixed, set in stone. Reality is perceived differently person on person. It's like, for example, I'm sure you've had this discussion with friends before.
Is my green your green?
seeing the same green? Is it the same reality, or does your green look like my red, for example? Who knows? How can we know? So the argument there is that reality is changeable. The only thing we can really believe and trust are our feelings, instincts, intuitions. So with that type of view of reality, there's room there for the unexplained, the unknown, what is real, what is not. An objective view on reality is that something's either real or it's not. A subjective view on reality is that, well, it could be real to me, but might not be real to you. So I think this novella, it not only questions things like the legal system, the police system, social hierarchy. I think it challenges in some ways the way we perceive reality, and it questions whether looking and believing and perceiving reality as this objective thing based on like facts and truth and logic and reason. It questions whether that's the most useful way of looking at reality. If you think then about the character of Utterson, well, Utterson, he's very, like Lanyon, objectivist in his mode of thinking. So he is always looking for the hard evidence. He doesn't believe anything until he sees it. He has to go and see it for himself. He goes for all the evidence. So the cane, the will, the letters. He's all about collecting cold hard evidence, and from that being able to establish what's really going on. But as we see, he couldn't be further from the truth of what's going on. He gets it really wrong. He jumps to conclusions, and there might be a message from Stevenson in there that it's actually a very narrow way of looking at reality to think that there's a rational explanation for everything, and that reason and logic are supreme. That's actually a very limited way of looking at things. So I think in the character of Utterson, he's looking at the kind of inadequacies of an objectivist mode of thinking. And besides that, the inadequacies of the legal system and its ability to determine what's right and what's wrong, and the corruptness of the legal system, because he is a guy who's apparently, his job role is delivering justice in society, and yet he has information, evidence that could lead to the arrest of this criminal, and yet he withholds that because of his selfish interests in his friend. The last night, it is page 41 in my book, if you want to get that ready. Mr. Utterson was sitting by his fireside one evening after dinner when he was surprised to receive a visit from Poole. Right. Why is Utterson surprised to receive a visit from Poole? So is he normally surprised by visitors? Probably he's surprised because Poole is so beneath him in social standing, isn't a friend, wouldn't normally interact, so it's a surprise to him to have Poole appear. And that's really highlighting how rigid social hierarchy was at the time. "Bless me, Poole, what brings you here?" he cried. Again, crying, he's crying out. It just really indicates his surprise, his shock. Why would a servant take it upon himself to visit someone of his social standing type thing? And then taking a second look at him, "What ails you?" he added. "Is the doctor ill?" "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." Right. So as you can see, Utterson refers to Poole as Poole. He doesn't use Mr., Sir, none of it. So that could definitely connote a lack of respect and a certain degree of snobbishness here coming from Utterson. "Mr. Utterson," said the man, "there is something wrong." Right. Something very vague, that abstract noun. To what is it referring? So immediately you've got, very typical of the Gothic, you've got foreshadowing. So something bad's going to happen here, clearly. And you've got the withholding of information, both very stereotypical, conventional techniques of the Gothic genre. So if you were to comment on something like that, you're getting marks for AO2 because you're talking about a technique that Stevenson is using, and also AO3 by linking it to the Gothic genre. "Take a seat, and here's a glass of wine for you," said the lawyer. "Now, take your time, and tell me plainly what you want." It's interesting to look at how Utterson addresses Poole. He speaks in imperatives. "Tell me plainly." Quite commanding. The adverb plainly, I think, is interesting because this really ties in with Utterson and his mindset, and what I was saying about Utterson, in that he embodies a very objective approach to seeing and perceiving the world, a very material way of seeing the world. He believes it when he sees it, or when he hears it type thing. Poole replies, "You know the doctor's ways, sir," replied Poole. So, again, referring to that their difference in social standing is made really obvious here. But Utterson being higher up on the social ladder, does that make him a better person? No. That's the point Stevenson's making. I mean, Utterson will happily, in his practice as a lawyer, take on downgoing men, so men who are in trouble, he's happy to help them out. He's withheld information from the police that could have brought a criminal to justice. So he's really... Utterson represents himself and certainly perceives himself as a very scrupulous man with good morals, etc. But his actions don't match up with that to a large extent. And how he shuts himself up. Well, he shuts up again in the cabinet, and I don't like it, sir. I wish I may die if I like it. Mr. Utterson, sir, I'm afraid. Okay, Poole. So whereas Utterson wants plain facts, Poole is kind of getting lost in his emotion and his feelings about this whole affair. He's saying, I don't like it. I wish I may die if I like it. That's a very extreme expression. And he really emphasises that he's afraid. So here you've got those extremes of emotion, very typical of the Gothic. And also Poole seems to be constructed as very much a binary opposite to Utterson. Utterson deals in logic, reason, plain facts. Here's Poole, a guy who's very much guided by his intuition and his feelings. So Poole seems here to be embodying that way of seeing the world that's far more subjective, guided by personal experience, feelings, emotions, intuition. Now, my good man, said the lawyer, be explicit. What are you afraid of? Again, Utterson deals in hard facts and evidence. He wants people to be plain, clear, direct, explicit, which is the very opposite of what Poole is being, and hence why you have this tension going on here between them. He's being very commanding, again, imperatives, be explicit. What are you afraid of? I've been afraid for about a week, returned Poole, doggedly disregarding the question. So Poole won't respond in plain facts. He's too overcome with emotion. And I can bear it no more, hyperbole, feeling his emotions in a really extreme way. The man's appearance amply bore out his words. His manner was altered for the worse. So Poole now, he said he's really scared, and what Stevenson's putting across here is that he was so scared that it had changed his physical appearance. That really seems to link back to Lanyon, who also was changed physically by what he witnessed. His hair went white, he went pale, he was gaunt, he wasn't the same man as before. So again, whatever's going on, the core of this mystery has such an effect on people that it affects them not just psychologically but also physically, which would suggest for them to be having such extreme reactions that there's something odd and supernatural going on. And like I said, with the Gothic, the supernatural element is never made explicit. What's scary about the Gothic is that you don't know if it's real or not. When he had first announced his terror, he had not once looked the lawyer in the face. Even now he sat with a glass of wine untasted on his knee, and his eyes directed to a corner of the floor. I can bear it no more, he repeated. So very, very visibly disturbed by whatever he's seen. And we don't know what he's seen. We don't know why he's so disturbed. We don't know what's going on. So again, Stevenson, as per usual, is really craftily developing tension here. Come, said the lawyer. I see you have some good reason, Poole. I see there is something seriously amiss. Try to tell me what it is. I think there's been foul play, said Poole hoarsely. "Foul play," cried the lawyer, a good deal frightened, and rather inclined to be irritated in consequence. So what's happened here is Utterson is frightened by the idea that there might be something dodgy going on, but he's irritated at himself for being frightened. So this is a man who's usually very disengaged with his emotions. So again, you see that binary opposition between Utterson's reaction to events and Poole's reaction. Poole's reaction is entirely emotive. He just has a feeling about what's going on and it's terrifying him. Utterson just wants hard material facts, empirical evidence, using his logic and reason to then piece the story together and figure things out. But that kind of way of interpreting the world, interpreting reality as something objective and shared, and it's all based on logic and evidence and whatnot, that is being represented in the novella as being like sorely inadequate, because he is so far off, Utterson is so far off from what's really going on. "What foul play? What does the man mean?" "I daren't say, sir," was the answer, "but will you come along with me and see for yourself?" Mr. Utterson's only answer was to rise and get his hat and great coat, but he observed with wonder the greatness of the relief that appeared upon the butler's face, and perhaps with no less that the wine was still untasted when he set it down to follow. Again, Utterson, direct, practical, no nonsense, man of action, gets on his coat, his hat, and he's going in there to find out what's going on. He's not overcome in the same way that Poole is with emotion. So yeah, this passage is very heavy on the Gothic conventions. There's also a semantic field going on of kind of chaos and instability. Chaos and instability are themes that emerge a lot in the novella, and they tie into, remember what I told you guys about the fin de siècle fears, the end of the 19th century. The world was an uncertain place. What does it mean to be human now that we know that we evolved from apes? What can we trust in religion anymore? What is reality? All of these philosophers kind of questioning, is there an objective reality? Are there objective truths, etc.? So a very uncertain time. And that's really, a lot of the time, comes about in the tone of the novella, in the descriptions of the setting of London. So it was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March. So wild, the weather's wild, instability, uncertainty, chaos. With a pale moon lying on her back as though the wind had tilted her. So this is interesting in a number of ways. The moon's been personified, kind of gives it a kind of supernatural air, because she's lying on her back, as though the wind had tilted her. So the wind physically itself has tilted the moon. Tilting, that verb implying instability. There are a lot of active verbs here which are linked to the wind. So the wind is tilting. The wind was making talking difficult. The wind was flecking their cheeks. The wind swept the streets. The wind here is depicted as something very powerful. So there's this idea here that there are larger, more powerful forces at work, elements beyond human control. So it's the wind that has the control here. It makes the character seem even more vulnerable. The idea of superior forces at work beyond human beings touches on like supernatural as well. There are larger forces at work here. So, on a flying rack of the most diaphanous and lawny texture. Right, a rack is just like a group of clouds. Diaphanous means almost transparent. So just a really thin veil. Why are the clouds? Why is the fog suddenly becoming less thick? Maybe because we're getting closer to the truth of the mystery, closer to what's going on with Jekyll and Hyde. The mystery is slowly being unveiled at this point, and perhaps that's why the fog metaphor here, this extended metaphor of fog right through the novella, that's why the fog is becoming less and less opaque at this point, more and more transparent. The wind made talking difficult and flecked the blood into the face. Blood has been mentioned, obviously, intentionally, foreshadowing violence, danger. It seemed to have swept the streets, unusually bare of passengers. So there's hardly anyone in the streets. Again, these active verbs do the wind. The wind is in control here, not the human characters. That adverb unusually, the novella's littered with words like belonging to the same semantic field of oddness or not being quite right, which just links in the Gothic. Also, it's a convention of the Gothic when describing setting to create really desolate settings where there's no one around. Helps to build tension. For Mr. Utterson thought he had never seen that part of London so deserted. Again, hyperbole. There's something very strange about this situation, like extremely so. He could have wished it otherwise. Never in his life had he been conscious of so sharp a wish to see and touch his fellow creatures. Creatures, comparing humans to animals, is that a subtle nod to the idea of us all having deeper animalistic tendencies that we just try to keep in check? For struggle as he might, there was borne in upon his mind a crushing anticipation of calamity. Crushing, that verb is very violent. Calamity means disaster, so foreshadowing something's going to happen here, but we don't know what. This description, and don't forget to talk about sentence forms. When you get your extract, there'll be something you can say about sentence forms, be they really short, snappy sentences or very long-winded ones. Here you've got very long sentences, arguably kind of reinforces this idea there's a lot going on all at once, chaos, slows the pace down, building tension subsequently. The square, when they got there, was full of wind and dust, and the thin trees in the garden were lashing themselves along the railing. The trees have been personified as well, so the idea of the natural world being personified given human characteristics again adds to that air of the supernatural that you've got going on. Lashing means whipping. Again, it's a verb to do with violence. The violence already having been connoted in that verb. Crushing and the mention of blood. So semantic field of violence here just helps to further create this idea of there being some kind of impending threat. Poole, who had kept all the way a pace or two ahead, now pulled up in the middle of the pavement, and in spite of the biting weather, again, biting, there you go, violence, took off his hat and mopped his brow with a red pocket handkerchief. That red pocket handkerchief, it's almost like a red flag. Danger is coming. You have the red baize of the cabinet door. So we think about red, we think about danger, we think about blood being spilt, violence, etc. But for all the hurry of his coming, there were not the dews of exertion that he wiped away, but the moisture of some strangling anguish. Again, strangling, the violence, the semantic field of violence is really obvious here. For his face was white, and his voice when he spoke, harsh and broken. Right, this description of Poole really recalls Lanyon, because Lanyon's voice was broken, Lanyon's voice turned white. So this Hyde character, or whatever is going on between Jekyll and Hyde, seems to universally have a deeply disturbing effect on people, one that's not just psychological but also physical. And again, this is alluding to supernatural goings on here. Well, sir, he said, here we are, and God grant there be nothing wrong. Amen, Poole, said the lawyer. But again, with these descriptions of Lanyon, of Poole as being visibly changed, turning white, etc., it seems something supernatural is going on, but it's not made explicit. It's purely implicit that there are weird goings on here, and it's reinforced by like unusual, strange, all those types of words that keep recurring. And that's what the Gothic genre is about. The Gothic genre generates fear not by kind of explicitly creating monsters to terrify people and whatever else, but by really cultivating a sense of uncertainty, not knowing whether something's real or not. That's what's frightening in Gothic literature. It's the mystery. It's the kind of second guessing and not knowing. It makes it all the more frightening. Thereupon the servant knocked in a very guarded manner. The door was opened on the chain. Chain, a symbol for restraint, holding back, the same kind of restraint that Jekyll's undergoing in trying to keep Hyde locked away, and then the same kind of restraint that underlies like Victorian social norms, the repressed nature of that society. And a voice asked from within, "Is that you, Poole?" "It's all right," said Poole. "Open the door." The hall, when they entered it, was brightly lighted up. The fire was built high, so a fire implies an increasing lack of control. Fire proliferates rapidly, can't be controlled, a lot like Hyde's behaviour, a lot like the danger that's impending at this point. About the hearth, the whole of the servants, men and women, stood huddled together like a flock of sheep. That simile, comparing them to a flock of sheep, really emphasises their vulnerability at this point. This is interesting now. So, Utterson sees all the servants together, all huddled together. They're obviously scared. They're trying to keep safe. So, huddled, that verb, implying they want to be close. They're scared, stay safe. At the sight of Mr. Utterson, the housemaid broke into hysterical whimpering. Extremes of emotion, again, very gothic. And the cook, crying out, "Bless God, it's Mr. Utterson," ran forward as if to take him in her arms. So they're so happy to see him. And then this completely juxtaposes with his... and they're full of emotion, and this juxtaposes with how he responds. So he then turns around and says, What? Are you all here?" said the lawyer peevishly. Peevishly, that adverb means annoyed. "Very irregular, very unseemly. Your master would be far from pleased." So basically, it's not normal or appropriate for servants to gather together. So on seeing these servants, who are obviously terrified, huddled together, crying, etc., the first thing that comes to his mind is, well, why are you all stood together? So that really shows you just how deeply ingrained social norms were at the time, and just how strict the social code was, the code of social conduct. So yeah, a time of great distress, and all Utterson's bothered about is proper social conduct, maintaining proper etiquette. Yeah, because he refers to it as irregular and unseemly, so unseemly means inappropriate. "They're all afraid," said Poole. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. So again, he has no empathy here. Because these people are beneath him and they're not behaving in the manner that they should. Blank silence followed, no one protesting. Only the maid lifted up her voice and now wept loudly. "Hold your tongue," Poole said to her, with a ferocity of accent that testified to his own jangled nerves. Poole is displaying a ferocity in the way he's speaking to her. So again, hinting at this animalistic side to her. Jangled nerves he has. Jangled meaning he's really on edge, as is everybody in this scene, as are we as readers, because we don't know what's going on. And all of this dialogue here, all this is serving to do is really slow down the pace of the action and build tension further. And indeed, when the girl had so suddenly raised the note of her lamentation, they had all started and turned towards the inner door with faces of dreadful expectation. So everybody's just sat there on edge. Adverbs like suddenly, there's a real sense of panic. Started, so that they jumped. Everybody's jumpy, everybody's on edge, and it foreshadows that whatever's going on beyond that door is something very worrying. "And now," continued the butler, addressing the knife boy, "reach me a candle and we'll get this through hands at once." The fact that Poole's referred to as the butler and he addresses the knife boy could have been intentional on Stevenson's part, because he might have been kind of commenting on how the lower class of society become defined by their servile duties. That's all they are, that's all they're worth. So they're a butler and that's that, or they're a knife boy and that's that. And that's really highlighting like the massive divide between the rich and the poor at the time. There is a lot of kind of active verbs. This is a really action-packed segment of the novella. You've got verbs like started, jerk, through, and again these verbs are all to do with kind of violent instability. What's interesting as well about this part of the novella is that it's an epistolary novel. So that means it's written, a lot of it is written in the form of letters. Whereas here, this isn't a letter. This is, we're not having the action. Well, we are having the action told to us as if it's already happened because it's in past tense. But there is a greater sense of live action because we're hearing it kind of through the third person narrative. It's not a second-hand account here. This is the action as it's happening, even if it is told in past tense. So there, arguably, Stevenson has played with the form of the novella and he's switched from the letter format to, in scenes, really dramatic scenes, back to third person narrative to make us feel like we're closer to the action. And to heighten the drama of those moments. Now, sir, said he, you come as gently as you can. I want you to hear, and I don't want you to be heard. And see here, sir, if by any chance he was to ask you in, don't go. Foreshadowing, why can't you go in, withholding information again. Mr. Utterson's nerves at this unlooked-for termination gave a jerk that nearly threw him from his balance. So they're very violent verbs, jerk, throwing. And also, Utterson's the rational one, the logical one, the one who doesn't become overcome by his emotions. For him to be nervous is a big deal. But he recollected his courage and followed the butler into the laboratory building and through the surgical theatre, with its lumber of crates and bottles to the foot of the stair. Really long sentences again, slowing down the pace. The mention again of the surgical theatre creates quite an eerie tone. Kind of connotes violence, death. Here, Poole motioned him to stand on one side and listen, while he himself, setting down the candle and making a great and obvious call in his resolution, mounted the steps and knocked with a somewhat uncertain hand on the red baize of the cabinet door. So there's a really long sentence for what effectively is just him knocking on the door, but again, Stevenson is purposefully slowing down the pace of the action to mount tension even further. So we feel like we're mounting now towards some kind of climax. That's definitely how this has been set up structurally. So we'll see what this climax is that we reach eventually then. Also, the red baize of the cabinet door. Is this foreshadowing again? Is this another red flag, danger ahead type thing? Mr. Utterson, sir, asking to see you, he called. And even as he did so, once more violently signed to the lawyer to give ear. So that adverb, violence again. As readers now, we're very much poised for something massive to happen. We're poised for a great climax in the action. That's how everything's been set up for us. But what we do end up with is just a total anticlimax, which only serves to further the tension, to make us want to keep reading. So a voice answered from within. Tell him I cannot see anyone, it said complainingly. It, again, withholding information. Who is the voice, this disembodied voice? It's very creepy, very eerie. Thank you, sir, said Poole, with a note of something like triumph in his voice. And taking up his candle, he led Mr. Utterson back across the yard and into the great kitchen. So there we go, that's all we got. We just got a voice saying, I'm not seeing anyone. And that's it. All of that tension had been building for that real anticlimax. Where the fire was out and the beetles were leaping on the floor. That image of beetles leaping, again, leaping, high action, everything's alive in this scene. Really, beetles leaping, I think, creates a sense of like jitteriness and being on edge. It really adds to that. Sir, he said, looking Mr. Utterson in the eyes, was that my master's voice? It seems much changed, replied the lawyer, very pale, but giving look for look. Again, somebody else with a changed voice. Lanyon's voice changed, Poole's voice changed. Whatever's going on here is having a profound effect on people. And again, there seems like there's something supernatural at play. And again here, Utterson now is turning pale. The rational Utterson is really getting frightened now and really affected. Changed? Well, yes, I think so, said the butler. Have I been 20 years in this man's house to be deceived about his voice? No, sir. Master's made away with. He was made away with 8 days ago, when we heard him cry out upon the name of God. and who's in there instead of him, and why it stays there. Again, it's suggesting some kind of monster, something unhuman. Is a thing that cries to heaven, Mr. Utterson. This is a very strange tale, Poole. This is rather a wild tale, my man. So instantly, Utterson is sceptical of whatever Poole's saying. So Poole just has this intuition, this feeling as to what's happened. And Utterson, because it doesn't seem logical, is kind of just dismissing it, referring to it as strange and wild. Everything must have a rational... In Utterson's worldview, everything must have a logical, rational explanation, and what Poole is proposing right now doesn't. So you get there, again, it evokes that dichotomy between like an objectivist perception of reality and then more subjectivist one. Said Mr. Utterson, biting his finger. Suppose it were as you suppose. Supposing Dr. Jekyll to have been, well, murdered, what could induce the murderer to stay? That won't hold water. It doesn't commend itself to reason. That reason is what Utterson believes helps us to make sense of the world. Reason can always be applied. There's a logical explanation for everything. Right, I think I'll carry on with this in the next video, because I've given you loads to work with there. I'm going to put on class charts, I'm going to put that extract to do with the weather. So the one, it was a wild, cold, seasonable night of March. And I'm going to recommend that you at least plan, but if possible, write an answer in response to the question I'm going to give you with that. Remember, you just use the same structure as you would for Macbeth. So the way I taught you, I said, pick out 3 really interesting quotes, maybe a couple more, sprinkle in a couple more textual pieces of textual detail from the extract. And that's going to form the backbone of your answer. But then you use those quotes as a springboard to look at the rest of the novella and where else either that theme is evoked or where else Stevenson uses that technique and to what effect, etc. Yeah, that's it. And I'll have a new video coming soon. If you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. Like, subscribe, etc. Whatever you do on here. See you soon. Bye.